Heidegger was one of this generation who were born in the 1880s. Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, many other of the great figures of modern philosophy and theology. And one of the things that's important about that is that they were students before the First World War, that they'd already embarked on their intellectual trajectory before that war began, and came to those experiences with a certain maturity. For Heidegger, who was the son of the sexton of a local church, so from relatively humble origins, that initial education meant studying Catholic philosophy at the University of Freiburg. Actually, he began doing theology and then changed to mathematics and to philosophy, took his doctoral thesis in 1913, and then in 1915 took his Habilitation, which is the German certificate that allows you to be a university teacher, on Duns Scotus, so in scholastic theology. The general view is that he was hoping that this would be enough to give him a chair in Catholic philosophy at Freiburg, but that didn't happen. It was a complex time for him. He had to do some military service, though not on the front line. He fell in love and got married to a Protestant woman, and he himself, for reasons that remain unclear, drifted away or moved away from Catholicism to a kind of independent, free Protestantism. In 1919, he became an assistant, a teaching assistant, research assistant to Edmund Husserl, who was, of course, one of the great figures in German philosophy at that time, one of the founders of the modern school of phenomenology, and with an extraordinarily brilliant circle of students around him, amongst whom, for example, was Edith Stein, now in the Catholic dispensation, the patron saint of Europe, and Heidegger worked with her on editing Husserl's phenomenological study of time consciousness together. So it was an extraordinarily intellectually exciting group. Heidegger's first appointment was at the University of Marburg after that, from 1923 to 8, where he became friends with and colleagues with Rudolf Bultmann. And of course, if one's a theologian, one often gets the impression that Bultmann, as it were, got all his ideas from Heidegger and simply applied them to the New Testament. I think it's clear, if you look at the history of that relationship, that it was both ways, and they would meet regularly together to work on the Gospel of John. Heidegger gave seminars on Luther in Bultmann's seminar series, so it was a genuine collaboration between two people who had a great deal intellectually in common. Being and Time was published in 1927, so Heidegger's 38 at the time, and this enabled him to take up the chair of philosophy at the University of Freiburg and to go back to Freiburg now as professor. This is in many ways a high point of his career. The low point was soon to follow, namely when he accepted becoming rector of Freiburg University in 1933, and at the same time became a member of the Nazi Party. And of course, this is something that has dogged the whole perception of Heidegger ever since. It's true that he left the party. Well, it remains highly debated as to what his relations with the party were. He stepped down as rector after just over a year. His own telling of the story is that he was pretty disillusioned with the Nazis by the middle of the 1930s. Others suggest contrary evidence. It's a very, very muddy and murky period, but there's no doubt that even on a best reading, Heidegger certainly didn't cover himself with glory, and the worst reading is a lot worse than that. And of course, that then also raises the question as to whether his Nazism was simply a kind of personal foible, a bit of careerist opportunism perhaps, or whether there is something about his work itself, about his ideas, that contributed to that step. Recently, a very controversial book was published in France by a philosopher called Emmanuel Faye, called Heidegger, The Introduction of Nazism into Philosophy, and Faye signs some sort of reference to Nazism in just about every line Heidegger ever wrote, and I think most people think that's clearly an exaggeration, and sometimes even perhaps rather stupid and and forced, but it is a sort of question hanging around the interpretation of Heidegger, and some texts more than others seem to be very susceptible to that kind of reading. The war ended, of course, in catastrophe for Germany and catastrophe for Heidegger himself. He had a mental breakdown for a while, and in the denazification program, he was banned from teaching. So he had to step down from his university post and was reinstated in 1950, a year before his retirement. During this period, a number of new themes started to emerge in his thought, and not least the critique of technology in some exceptionally dense and difficult lectures, which, funnily enough, because of the circumstances of his having been stood down from his university post, were given to a business club in Bremen, something like the Rotary Club, really, and one kind of is rather amused to think what they might have made of some of these exceptionally gnomic utterances from the great philosopher. And so through retirement, he continued to hold seminars, to give guest lectures on a whole range of occasions, always coming up with something extraordinarily fascinating and interesting, such as when he's invited to go back to his hometown of Meßkirch on the 800th anniversary of its founding to give a sort of talk, as the famous local boy made good, and speaking really in a very simple way to ordinary people, yet drawing some really interesting philosophical ideas into the discussion. He died in 1976. I was in Germany at the time, in fact, so when he died, the magazine Der Spiegel published an interview that he'd actually given many years before, but asked to be held back until his death, in which he did touch on some of these questions of his Nazism, though not really in any great depth. But what the interview is chiefly famous for is his saying in the course of it, "Only a God can save us, nur ein Gott kann uns retten," that the contemporary human situation under the dominion of planetary technology had drifted so far from its genuine origins and possibilities that indeed only a God can save us. So in some ways, it wasn't an eventful life compared with many of his contemporaries, and he's not someone whose biography fascinates in the way that, say, the life of Dostoevsky, perhaps even in its own small way, the life of someone like Kierkegaard sort of fascinates or appeals or attracts. And although he was clearly a hugely charismatic university teacher, this sort of historical distance, I think on the whole, he's not a greatly charismatic personality, and perhaps in a sense his life, his personality are not so important for understanding his philosophy. One of my colleagues says he begins his lectures on Heidegger by saying the following: Heidegger was born, Heidegger was a Nazi, Heidegger died. That's all you need to know about Heidegger. Now let's look at his thought. So yeah, we can't avoid knowing a little bit about the life, but I think in this case it's not going to be decisive for how we really engage with the thought. As I've been saying, Heidegger started out as a would-be Catholic philosopher. A lot of his early work and training is in scholastic philosophy. This is the subject of his Habilitationsschrift on Duns Scotus. Well, he thought it was by Duns Scotus, but scholars tell me that it's actually a text by Henry of Ghent. But anyway, so this is what he's looking at, and he says he's interested in the scholastics because he sees medieval man, as it were, is obviously pre-Cartesian man, that the intellectual passions of the Middle Ages were different from the intellectual passions of the modern age, and there isn't, Heidegger believed, a split between experience and theory in scholasticism. At least that's what he says in 1915. By 1919, when he's lecturing or preparing lectures on medieval mysticism, he's come to a different view. He now sees scholastic philosophy, he calls it pseudo-philosophy. He believed that it had gone down the wrong route, turned living religion into theory, and now he's looking to medieval mysticism to find what he's looking for, to find a more original expression of original religious experience. Those lectures never get given, but a couple of years later, he then starts lecturing on St. Paul, of all people, in phenomenology of religious life. And what he's interested in, coming to this in a perspective framed by Husserlian phenomenology, is not Paul's doctrine, not what Paul taught in that sense, but what he calls the how of early Christian experience, in the sense, how did Paul experience the world? How did Paul experience his being in the world? And what Heidegger particularly focuses in on is the time experience of the early Christian community as that comes to expression in the writings of Paul, that Paul is living between the times, between the death of Christ and his coming again, a time of tribulation, of abandonment, if you like. The past is past, the future hasn't yet come, but it's the future he's living for. So there's a structure of lived time there that Heidegger finds immensely interesting. And as we see him moving towards being in time, we can see this structure of temporality that he found in Paul being, if you like, universalized, that what Paul experienced reveals something about human beings in general experience time. Now, at the same time, through the 1920s, another major interest in Heidegger's development is Aristotle. Throughout the 1920s, he's lecturing again and again on various texts by Aristotle covering the metaphysics, the physics, the rhetoric, the Nicomachean ethics, a whole range of texts, and indeed on Plato, a huge lecture series on the Sophists, so engaging deeply with classical philosophy. Brilliant lectures which often start off with him reading in Greek a long passage to his students and then giving a highly original translation of it and then going through the issues that come up. Now, of course, one of the fundamental metaphysical questions that he encounters in Aristotle's metaphysics, is the question, what is being? That metaphysics, according to Aristotle, is the study of being qua being as being. What is it for being to be? And this becomes the question that Heidegger takes up in Being and Time. Shortly after Being and Time was published, Bultmann was approached by the editors of the big encyclopedia Religion in Geschichte und Gegenwart to write an article on this new star, Martin Heidegger. So Bultmann wrote a little article, sent it to Heidegger, who made a few marks in it, but said basically you've got it right. And then that's the article that was published. So that gives us a pretty good impression of what Heidegger thought he was about at that time. And it's an extraordinarily interesting mix of different strands. He says, yes, he's taking over the basic ontological questions of ancient philosophy, also as they were worked through in scholastic theology. He seems to have become a little bit more amicable towards it again by this time. But at the same time, doing so in the light of the new experience and understanding of human subjectivity that comes from Augustine, Luther, and Kierkegaard. And at the same time, through doing this, he hopes to discover the true motivations of German idealism. And at the same time, to bring this into dialogue with the historical thought of thinkers like Wilhelm Dilthey, very important, and the Lebensphilosophy of that time. So an extraordinarily rich philosophical mix flowing into the genesis of this work. But in many ways, the background in Aristotle is foundational to it all. Even if Aristotle doesn't get too many footnotes in Being and Time, his presence is quite constant, I think, particularly in the first half of that work. The second half, one can see more of the Augustine, Luther, and Kierkegaard coming in. So the stage is set for this extraordinary book, really, which is undoubtedly one of the most astonishing books of philosophy produced in the 20th century. On the very first page of Being and Time, Heidegger says, "Do we even know what the question of being means?" No, we don't. So what the book is devoted to is to simply, at one level, asking the question of being. What do we mean when we say being? Do we understand what we're saying when we say it? Does it mean anything at all? And there's a certain reading of Being and Time that says, actually, Heidegger never gives us an answer, and giving us an answer isn't what he's about as a philosopher. He wants us to be able to raise the question. You know, he's not standing there saying, this is how it is, I'm going to tell you the truth of being. He's saying, come on, engage with this question, think about it. How are we going to think about it? Because we don't know what the question means, or because the question has been handed down to us by a tradition that in his phrase has become ossified, has simply become a sort of textbook question that people learn off by rote, we're going to have to begin again. We're going to have to start again. How can we do that? Well, he says, where else could we possibly start than with the being that we ourselves are? Because we are, whatever else may be the case, we are the beings for whom their own being is an issue. This is where we start, but who are we? Again, he says we can't take any assumptions about what it is to be human for granted, and he introduces this phrase, Dasein, that of course virtually untranslatable, though one hears many different translations. One of the ones I like best is, here I am, question mark, exclamation mark. Just being there, here I am. You know, that is astonishing, exclamation mark, question mark, what does it mean? The question of the meaning of being to the being that's there or here. Now, Heidegger says, if we really stay close to this, we will see that that being that we are in this opening revelation of being is not yet a Cartesian subject, is not an ego confronting a world out there, but in another kind of classic Heideggerian phrase, is being in the world. So for Heidegger, it's not the case, as it is for so many philosophers, that you begin with the question, how can I, this self-conscious ego, come to know objects out there in the external world? How can I be sure that they are real? Or conversely, how can I be sure that I am real? For Heidegger, this is simply a non-question, a completely pointless question, because it's not where we begin. We begin as being in the world, and the world out there and the I in there only arise through subsequent reflection on experience. We are always already involved in the world, and it's out of that involvement that we subsequently abstract our ideas of there being a world out there and a self in there. So when he's lecturing in some lectures preparatory to Being and Time, he says, chalk. He says, I don't kind of stand there, look at chalk, say, what is chalk, define chalk. He said, no, I want to write something on the blackboard, so I pick up the chalk and I start writing it. I get to know what chalk is by using it as chalk. It's what we experience things as in the context of our everyday traffic with them. And that applies also to perception. What I see a thing as. I see a flock of birds. That is, I see them as a flock. So we have certain basic intuitions, and we ourselves are tied up with these because of this structure of being in the world. Now, another important step. Of course, there's just so much I'm glossing over and so many different ways one can take this material and so many different and difficult philosophical discussions to be had, but we want to kind of pick out some of the central things here. And for Heidegger, the way in which our being in the world is revealed to us is, in a slightly complex way, through three fundamental aspects of human being. And these are what often gets translated as mood, understanding, and discourse. I'll go through these one by one. The mood, the German word is Befindlichkeit, which has a word like the English find in the middle of it, that we always find ourselves being a certain way. That, you know, I meet you on the street and you say, "Hi George, how are you?" I say, "I'm all right." I find myself being all right. I don't have to think about whether I'm all right or not. I just say, yeah, it's all right. I find myself being a certain way. Mood. But that is also a certain understanding. I have an understanding of myself. I'm the sort of being who could feel all right or not all right. To be able to say I'm all right involves a certain understanding of what it is to be human. But then the third thing, discourse, logos, is that I say it. I have something to say. I don't have an understanding of myself as all right and then find a word for it to fit the word onto it. But it's in saying the word that my understanding of how I find myself being comes to expression. Heidegger's project, he says, is phenomenology, under the inspiration of the phenomenology of Husserl. But what are phenomena? Phenomena are what come to appearance. But for Heidegger, logos is the primary mode in which being in the world comes to appearance. Not visual perception or tactile perception apart from logos, but it's in logos that the world becomes a world for us and we become existing human beings in a world, in our logos with one another. Indeed, he says, if we understand logos in the Greek sense, the original meaning of legein is dilun, it is uncovering. So when I say, look, there's a sparrow, my saying it's a sparrow shows you and reveals it to you as a sparrow. Well, perhaps you already know that, but if you're a 3-year-old, you don't, and my telling you shows you what that thing is that you're seeing. So language uncovers the world, language presents us with the phenomenon of the world and of our own being in the world. That's great, but there's a problem. Because as speakers of language, of course, we don't make language up. We receive language. We are inducted into an already existing language. And that's not just a matter of learning a vocabulary and a grammar, but learning phrases, figures of speech, ways of talking, and so on. Now, that means that in a sense, as language users, we're always using language second-hand. Derrida would say, I have only one language and it is not my own. That language is something we receive. The language we have wasn't designed to express or to articulate our unique and singular experiences and understandings. It's part of a complex common life. The great risk here, of course, then is that we can say things that we've heard without really understanding them in the light of our own experience. And when that happens, language is no longer uncovering the world, it's covering it up. In Heideggerian terms, discourse, which he uses the German word Rede, becomes Gerede, translated as idle talk or chatter. We're just repeating what others have said without understanding. Now, important here for Heidegger, I think people sometimes misread him at this point and say this is just a kind of manifestation of decadent life in the early 20th century. If you go back to his lectures on Aristotle and to the sort of life of the Greek agora reflected in Aristotle's writings, this is a problem right from the beginning of philosophy because it's built into the structures of language, and that we have and can't have language as anything but second-hand. And so here I am, talking about being in time, and a student might write down, being in time contains important new ideas such as the idea of Dasein and being in the world. Now, of course, that's not wrong. That is correct to say that. But just because the student's writing it down because I've said it doesn't mean that the student really understands. And a student could regurgitate an exam answer or an essay, a scholar could even regurgitate a book perhaps, or a whole series of books, without necessarily having an original kind of primordial understanding of what is being said in language. So in practice, we live in our average everyday way of being. The world is not uncovered, but the world is covered over by this way of talking, this Gerede, this idle talk. So what are we to do? How are we to get out of that situation? Here Heidegger introduces this term, another of these key terms that's become associated with him, Eigentlichkeit, authenticity. We have to find out what is truly our own and not just what is handed down to us or reflected back to us from our surrounding society. And we have to do this because it's only in this way that we can realize our lives as a whole and make of ourselves a whole, authentic human being. But then there's a problem. How can we be a whole? How can we live as a whole? Now, an object that didn't have time could be a whole, an object that was simply what and as it is. You know, the Greek vase that Keats writes about, simply a perfect object that doesn't become anything else. But here we are in the middle of a course of becoming. We're always changing, we're living from day to day, we're developing, becoming something new, ceasing to be what we are. We haven't yet lived all our possibilities. These still lie ahead of us. How can we live as a whole? And then there's something else, and that is, of course, all of us are going to die. And for Heidegger, this means that in a sense it seems impossible for us to live as our lives as a whole because our end is always going to escape us. And that means we can never really be sure about any of our possibilities in life. Any of the things that we're committed to could be cut short at any time. And indeed, this is one of the motivations as to why we find it so easy to slip into idle talk, second-hand talk, assuring ourselves that everything is in order, everything is in place, the world is well managed and as it should be. A way of avoiding confronting this terrifying, ineluctable fact that each of us individually must die. So for Heidegger, the only way to, as it were, lift ourselves out of this second-hand life of average everydayness is to look the prospect of our own death in the eye. His German word, translated in English as anticipation, Vorlaufen, means literally like running towards. So we run towards our death, we don't run away from it. And of course he has some wonderful passages, drawing partly on Tolstoy's short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, about how even when someone is dying, of course we go to visit them and we say, oh, everything's all right, hope you're fine, don't worry too much, things will be okay. Saying just about anything except what directly and truthfully states what's going on. But no, we need to confront the truth about ourselves, and that is that we are each of us singly going to die. And that none of this, as it were, reflects back onto the finitude of all of our possibilities, all of our human relationships, all of our work projects, all of our political programs, our technical projects. All of these are limited. We may try to absolutize them in our minds, but none of them can really bear the weight of absoluteness. Maybe it's a little bit like what Kierkegaard said in concluding Unscientific Postscript about being relative with the relative. Well, Kierkegaard also said we must be absolute with the absolute and relative with the relative, but for Heidegger it seems there's no absolute. Human beings are just thrown into the world, thrown towards their death. That's their condition. They have to accept that. I think at this point there's two very different ways of hearing what Heidegger's saying. One way is to hear it as a sort of heroic confrontation with death, looking death in the eye, running towards it, authentically resolute. A little bit like a civilian version of the soldier, and Heidegger is the First World War generation, going over the top, running towards the enemy lines. But at the same time, he's also saying, when you do this, actually, nothing much changes in your life. If you're a bank clerk and you become authentic, you don't give up being a bank clerk and go and live a kind of way out life on a South Sea island or anything like that, like Gauguin. You carry on being a bank clerk. but you are more aware of the limitations of your life, your finitude, your restrictions. You're a little bit humbler, perhaps less self-assertive, a bit quieter. The person who knows this doesn't make too big a song and dance about anything. So there's two very, very different ways, I think, of hearing what's going on here, and both there's some evidence in the text. If all this is to happen, of course, how can it happen? That it has to happen for Heidegger. We can't get out of time. We're always in time. Time is the horizon of any possible human meaning of being. But we're not just carried along, as it were, on the currents of time. Time isn't just rolling us along any old how. Well, maybe a lot of the time it is, but we have the alternative of, as it were, taking our time in hand in what Heidegger, using a term he borrows from Kierkegaard, calls the moment of vision, the Augenblick, the moment in which translates literally as the gaze or the glance of the eye, the moment in which we look around, we see ourselves, we see our lives for what it is, and in the light of that illumination, we then accept who we are in our finitude, in our solitude vis-a-vis our death, and move forward. And this moment of vision, again borrowing a term from Kierkegaard, is something that has to be repeated again and again. It's not a once and for all heroic thing in which, today I found the meaning of life, which is death, and now I can live authentically for the rest of my life. No, you have to do it every day. You have to, you can never, as it were, develop a habit of this. It's something you have to confront again and again and again. Now, being in time promised to be only the first part of a much bigger work, and that much bigger work was never written. Being in time itself, would have been enough to establish Heidegger's reputation, and certainly it gave a kickstart, as it were, to what became known as the philosophy of existence. And that then, of course, also had influence in France on the rise of French existentialism. In theology, it was taken up by Rudolf Bultmann, as we know, close colleague of Heidegger's. Important to say, actually, in connection with Bultmann, that 1933, the advent of the Nazis, marked the division between Heidegger and Bultmann, because Bultmann was from the very beginning a committed anti-Nazi. At the beginning of summer semester 1933, he sent out a letter to all students saying, of course, this is exciting times, but, not everything's good. And particularly not good is the vilifying of colleagues and friends on the grounds of their Jewish origins. This was published in the sort of student newspaper. So from the very beginning, Bultmann put his head above the parapet and said, there are things here that shouldn't be accepted. You could do that. Heidegger didn't do it. And from that time, Bultmann tried to make some protective gestures towards Heidegger in various of his lectures to say, we mustn't understand this infamous speech Heidegger gave on the occasion of being installed as rector in a racialist sense in any way. But that was, they went very different directions at that point. But Bultmann, nevertheless, and one can see, for example, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, how he uses many of Heidegger's ideas about word as revelation to interpret John's teaching about the Word made flesh and the light that illuminates every man coming into the world. When I say Bultmann used Heidegger, you can see in both of them their common conversations coming out in their important published work. Now, Being and Time is written in this kind of extraordinary, dense technical language that's very challenging to many readers, although it's a technical language that Heidegger, in a way, is making up as he goes along at many points. One more footnote to give about Being and Time is that Heidegger himself, of course, claimed that by the time he'd written Being and Time, he was no longer a theologian, he was no longer a Christian, that it was written under the auspices of atheism. However, important to say, I think, that for Heidegger, atheism didn't mean I don't believe in God out there, but simply a-theism. In other words, that one didn't take God into account. And neither did one take atheism in the conventional sense into account. It's neither affirming nor denying the existence of God, but it's abstracting from that and looking at the human condition in its own terms. So Bultmann could nevertheless find in it scope for a Christian interpretation, others a more radically atheist interpretation. Now in the 1930s we see Heidegger, and totally leaving on one side the question of his Nazism, turning to a number of new topics and a new way of writing, that Being and Time, as I say, was written in this heavy jargon, much which would be ridiculed by Adorno in his book on the jargon of authenticity. But Heidegger himself moves away from this in the 1930s. He starts lecturing on art in the lectures The Origin of the Work of Art, and especially on the poetry of Hölderlin, a poet extraordinarily important for Heidegger and his whole generation of Germans, one of the major romantic poets of the German romantic movement, but a very idiosyncratic poet, very different from any of the poets of English Romanticism, writing in a style that I think is quite difficult for English language readers to connect to, which is perhaps why a lot of this aspect of Heidegger's work is relatively less known in the English-speaking world, simply because we don't have Hölderlin, as it were, at our fingertips in the way we might have Wordsworth or Coleridge. But for Heidegger, when he's writing about Hölderlin, he's not writing about some obscure poet that only a few literati know. He's writing about the sort of poet that German soldiers going to the front in the First World War would buy and have in their backpacks and read in the trenches, a poet who was nationally revered and loved. And of course there are nationalist themes in Hölderlin's poetry, but it is, I think, what chiefly interests Heidegger is the notion of poetry itself. We've already seen, of course, the importance of language for Heidegger, of logos as Dilun, as uncovering. And for him, the poet is the supreme practitioner of this uncovering of the phenomenon of human being in the world in language. So it may look as if when he starts talking about Hölderlin's poems, about the Danube and the Rhine and the rest of them, as if he's totally left Being and Time behind, and he's doing it in vocabulary borrowed from Hölderlin's own writings. But this focus on the poet, I think we can understand in continuity with what he's saying in Being and Time, because the poet is the practitioner of language par excellence. A line from Hölderlin himself, the conversation that we are. Human beings have their lives in language. It is through how we speak that we constitute our humanity. And so when Heidegger describes how in one of Hölderlin's poems the poet summons the people to the festival, for Heidegger this means that it is in a sense the poet whose word that grounds the religious festival also in a sense grounds our experience of time, of how time is measured out, of how the year takes shape. So important continuities there as well. At the same time as Heidegger is developing these meditations on Hölderlin, he's also starting to write more and more about the question of technology that chiefly concerns him. Now, indeed, one of the interpretations of his Nazism is precisely that he saw Nazism as pointing the way back to a simpler, more traditional, more agrarian way of life and a rejection of the modern world with the big city and all its technology and so on. I don't know if that's what he did think, and certainly there was all that rhetoric about the return, to more traditional ways in Nazism. But certainly it became clear by the middle of the 1930s that the Nazis were more than committed to buying into the military-industrial machine and using every possible technological means to advance their cause. It is interesting that in a letter from Heidegger to Bultmann at the beginning of the war, he describes what's happening in terms of the hegemony of technology and says there's actually now no way we can stop this technological machine from bringing its ruin and destruction upon us all. The thing's been set in motion and can't be stopped. So that he sees the war itself as manifesting a power of technology that has simply run away from human control, that no one can bring it back under control anymore. However, I think it's wrong if we think of Heidegger simply as a Luddite in relation to technology. You know, that all modern technology is bad. The old world with windmills and water mills and homely peasants living in nice thatched roof houses is good. I don't think that's what it's about at all. And he himself says in subsequent lecture on the subject that, you know, the atom bomb, that's not the danger of technology. The danger of technology is simply that we allow ourselves to be fascinated by it, to be mesmerized by it, to be dragged along by it without really thinking about it. And he says what he's arguing for is that we should have a thinking, a thoughtful relation to technology, because only if we do that can we have a free relation to technology. If we just, as it were, hand ourselves over to technology, then it will take us to places we don't want to go, and we will lose our humanity. We will be dragged into a condition that he describes as planetary homelessness. We'll be uprooted, not knowing who we are. Here's the connection then between that and the poetry of Hölderlin. What the poet does, what Hölderlin, the German poet, does for German-speaking people, is to call them back to what is most their own, what is most proper to them. Again, he uses sometimes this word eigen, one's own, that we find in Eigentlichkeit, authenticity, to what is most proper to oneself, to one's own language, one's own words, the words that in the most original way reveal the world to us, spontaneously as we speak. Now, there's something very beautiful in that idea. And we could say that for Heidegger, it's Hölderlin, the German poet, who does that. For us, it might be, well, whoever our favoured English poet is. For Greeks, for French, each would have their own poet who would speak these original words. But of course, in the context of a 20th century ravaged by nationalisms of various kind, it's also perhaps slightly problematic as well. And undoubtedly there are passages in Heidegger that suggest that only people who speak Greek and German can really do philosophy, that these two languages have some sort of extra privilege, that they somehow penetrate deeper, they get closer to the things that they reveal in their words, that they have a kind of intrinsic connectedness with things in a way that Latin and other Romance languages, French and English, don't have. There is that there, but perhaps we can kind of keep that on one side and think about the positive aspect of this thought, that the poet, and you know, we can think here about our own favourite poet, whoever that might be, the poet calls us back to what is most our own, speaks the word that gives us our world, gives us our sense of self, and does so not so as to cancel out our relation to technology, but in such a way as to help us to go on being human in the middle of an age of technology that's dragging us out into this situation of planetary homelessness. And one can think, you know, of the situation of a person, any person from any culture, perhaps living far from home in economic exile, politically enforced exile, or simply travelling and, you know, sitting there with a volume of whatever their favourite poet is, and through those words, as it were, wherever they are and however they're living, connecting back with their original sense of self. And so that the poet for Heidegger, there's almost a sort of religious quality about it. Indeed, he said, what is it that the poet speaks to us? The poet speaks to us of the holy. The poet speaks and enables us to experience holiness in the middle of this technologized world. How does one respond to that as a theologian? it's a two-edged sword, of course, and one can, as in many ways of talking about literature and religion, see it as a secularizing move, that actually we don't need religion anymore because we have poets, we have our national poets. But I think it can also show us something about our own religion, about our own theology, that the word of the Bible itself is, in Heidegger's sense, perhaps a poetic word, a word that calls us to our own most proper being, and does so in such a way as to make our life and our experience holy. Now, of course, there's a difference in that most of us don't speak the languages of the Bible. Most of us have the Bible only as a translated document, second-hand, as it were. Already at the beginning of the 19th century, Hegel asked rhetorically, is Judea then the Teutons' fatherland? That, that the language of the Bible is an alien language. Well, perhaps if the language of the Bible is poetic and can function poetically for us in the way that Hölderlin's poetry functioned, worked for Heidegger, then we would have to say that perhaps this issue of the native language is, we would have to part company with Heidegger and say that the power of the word is not simply, as it were, in this fact of it being our mother language, but in some other aspect of it. Well, this is taking us into different territory, and quite complex territory, but I think it's fruitful to dwell on. A friend of mine recently wrote a little meditation on David, and why is it that David is the figure of the Messiah? Because when you look at him in the Bible, he's not obviously a very attractive figure. He's an adulterer, a killer, a sort of ruthless mafia boss in many ways. But he says, well, perhaps we shouldn't think of the Davidic messiahship as modelled on these aspects on David, but David the harpist, the poet, long believed, of course, to be author of the Psalms. David the singer, who sings the songs of God, and in singing the songs of God awakens us through his word to the presence of the Holy One. And I think that's to read the Psalms in a very Heideggerian and perhaps very productive way as well.